Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video on History Vibe podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Kara Cooney, and today we're going to be talking about the rise of Aten and the earliest monotheistic religion that we know of under Pharaoh Akhenaten. So welcome back to History Vibe podcast, Kara Cooney.
Thanks for having me, Jacob. It's lovely to be back on.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. So let me start off with this first question. Can you tell us who the Aten is for those that are unfamiliar?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because the Aten is kind of not even a who, but it is. So the Aten is an abstract understanding of the sun god, and the Aten pre-existed Akhenaten, whom we'll talk about later. But the Aten is a way of understanding the sun as the being that you see in the sky, rather than what the Egyptians or other cultures did and do so often, which is anthropomorphizing the divinity, anthropomorphizing the sun god, making him Re Herakti or Helios in a Greek system. The ancient Egyptians, they had something called the Litany of Re, and it had the 75 different manifestations of the sun. So they understood that the sun was manifold, was many. And the Aten, however, in a way underlines or is the foundation for those 75 different manifestations, because the Aten is the thing in the sky, the thing that you can see, the thing that you can feel, the thing that burns, the thing that gives its energy. And I say thing because I'm afraid to say disc and I'm afraid to say globe, because the way the ancient Egyptians actually created this Aten, this circular thing in two dimensions in relief, they would create this two-dimensional sun disk, and then they would give it a globular convexity to the surface. So I would argue from that evidence that the Egyptians understood the Aten, the sun itself, the physical sun, to have been circular, to have been round, rather than this flat disk. And yet in Egyptological texts, you'll often see this mentioned as the Aten sun disk. And I think I myself use that phrase rather than sun globe.
What does the let me rephrase that. When does the Aten first appear in the ancient Egyptian writings?
The Aten first appears in the Middle Kingdom as that physical representation of the sun. And so this is pretty old. We're talking about 4,000 years ago that you start to see this Egyptian understanding. I mean, I'm sure that even in the Old Kingdom or pre-dynastic, they had an understanding of the physical sun. But the Aten being the physical sun that is then divinized in addition to a sun god, that you start to see in the Middle Kingdom, but it's not actually made special or cultified until Amenhotep III, who really starts, and that's Akhenaten's father, who really starts with more of a cult towards the Aten and starts to build temple spaces. I'm thinking of his memorial temple at Akenhaten, or the solar court that he builds at Luxor Temple, and that he tricks out for the movement of the Aten within 365 days of a solar year.
Is it true that the Aten and Ra were originally the same god, or are they originally different from one another?
I don't know if we'll ever really know that. The Egyptians didn't go into any sort of philosophical treatise to help us understand how they understood the physicality of the divinity to differentiate from the Ba, the power of divinity, or the Ka, the soul or spirit of divinity. There are discussions of this in later Greco-Roman temples, or things like, what is divinity? How male or female is it? What is divinity? How do we understand its Ba'u, its power? How do we understand its Ka? It's a different kind of power. It seems to me that the Aten for Akhenaten, and maybe for Amenhotep III, though that part is really debatable, was about the physicality, the materiality, the sensorial ability to connect with the god, such that if you're talking about the sun god Re Herakti or Atum Re, or just Re, as you mentioned. You're thinking of something that can be made into a human form, but is also very abstract as an understanding. Whereas the Aten itself, you take away the human connection, you take away that abstract idea of God, and you make it about the physical materiality only. You make it about that presence. And when you do that, ironically, when you materialize the divinity, you make it more abstract than if it were the God that we could talk to or we could connect to. And it's an interesting thing to think about what it means to connect with divine things that are physical in an animist way, if you like a mountain or a lake, in this case, the sun. Of course, the Egyptians are pushing this forward by linking their king to that particular divinity. But yeah, this is how the Egyptians were working with this understanding of sun god.
Before the advent of Akhenaten's monotheism, did his father, Pharaoh Amenhotep III, worship the Aten? Is there evidence of it?
There is evidence of it. There's evidence of hymns for the sun god. Amenhotep III he's called Le Roi Soleil, French term for Louis XIV, but it's a wonderful moniker to associate with Amenhotep III for colonial Egyptologists, because he is a king obsessed with the sun and solar cults. And it seems he also worshipped the Aten in its physicalized form as something that moves around the earth, in that understanding. I'm not going to try to give a heliocentric understanding to the ancient Egyptians. There's no evidence for that until later times in Alexandria. But what Amenhotep III did do, let me give you one example. So there's this really cool temple that we call Akenhaten, and it's his temple of millions of years, or the temple that was purpose built for his for the king Amenhotep III's deification during and after death. And it's a space where, after he is buried in the Valley of the Kings, there will be a cult to his kingship, and that kingship will associate this king with Osiris and all of the chthonic deities, and with Re, Aten, Re Harakti, and all of the solar deities. And in that space, he actually builds a solar calendar in 3 dimensions. And that solar calendar includes 700, almost 800, maybe more actually, but 2 for each of the 365 days of the year, statues of the goddess Sekhmet. And we are to understand that for each day of the 365-year solar calendar, there were 2 fates, a good fate and a bad fate. And that's why if you go to almost any Egyptian collection worth their salt, whether it's the British Museum or the Louvre or Cairo, obviously, Torino in Italy, the Met, you will find these Sekhmet statues made of a black granite or granodiorite stone. And these statues were set up in this square, or I don't think circular. I think it was a square understanding. But this temple has since been dismantled. The temple was damaged by earthquakes. We don't have the original layout of these Sekhmets. But it seems to have been set up in a court, a square court, a rectangular court, probably square. And you have Sekhmet, 2 Sekhmets for each day. Some, what is that, 700 and, what's 365 times, 740? Is this correct? Shit. Sorry, Jacob. This is why.
Don't worry about it. It's fine.
This is why I became an Egyptologist after all. But so we have these this calendar, and then throughout this solar calendar, there's other statues of the king set up. There's other statues of astronomical or astrological decans of the 10-day week set up, which are representative of star constellations and are very strange and unusual creatures in stone. And so it seems that Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's father, is very interested in a materialized universe, a materialized that he can see, hear, feel, and touch. And to do that, he connects with the Aten in this architectural way, and his texts also mention the Aten as a physicalized manifestation of the sun god. Yeah.
Did Pharaoh Amenhotep IV actually make the Aten the only god during his reign? In other words, does the monotheism involving the Aten, does it fit our modern standards of today of what we consider to be monotheism, or is it not quite the same?
Yeah, this is a tricky one. And I talked about this a lot in, oops, I got to point this way, in that book that's right over my shoulder right here. There's a chapter on Akhenaten in my book, The Good Kings. And I talk about this at great length because there is a lot of Egyptological discussion, debate, disagreement about whether or not Akhenaten's religious scheme is monotheism. Can we call it that? Should we call it that? I would say that if you had asked me this in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s, it would have been obviously yes, it's a monotheistic system. He tells us that the Aten is Wa, he is alone, that he is solo on his divinity journey. But it's a gradient. So well, let me start with this. If you'd asked me in the 60s or 70s or 80s, I would have said yes, definitely monotheist. It is now fashionable to say no, it's not really monotheist because there were other divinities in this system. Because Akhenaten uses Re Herakti at the beginning of his reign, because Ma'at is included, and you can see Akhenaten offering Ma'at to the solar rays, particularly early on in his temple at Karnak. And you could also argue, no, it's not monotheist because he claims to be the king himself claims to be a physical emanation of this sun god. And so how can it be monotheism if there are all these other divinities? Well, my counter for that very fashionable argument of late is to say his reign, his 17-year reign, is a process. And his development of his own theology takes time. It doesn't come out whole cloth. It comes out in bits and pieces. It comes out with a punctuated equilibrium, a big jump here and then some stasis and then another jump. It's not something that he comes to the throne knowing exactly how to do. He has to learn on the job. He is the first one to do anything like this in all of human history. To have it documented the way we do is stunning and amazing. You do see Re Herakti in the name of the Aten at the beginning. In his cartouche name, the Aten is given a cartouche. Really weird. We can talk about that. He is associated with a king himself, this solar globe or solar disk. But that's removed. So Akhenaten is like, yeah, we call him Re Herakti, but he's dissatisfied with that. And that gets cleaned out over time. So you want to say that like any new ideology, any new theological creation, it needs new language. And language is something that is so associated with our basic needs to communicate and basic needs to say what is in the world, that when you're creating a theology of animism, a new monotheism of animism, I would argue, using the king as the shaman at the top of the social pyramid, when you're trying to create something like that, language itself has become problematic. So you have to come up with new words that serve the new regime or new system, new theological regime that you are creating. And words that were quite normal are now problematic. Or gods' names that were quite normal are quite problematic. But even the word Re, it becomes problematic because it's so associated with the sun god. Amen is a given. Amen-Re is problematic as a conglomerate word, but the notion of Re, the word for sun, becomes even rather problematic, and Akhenaten chooses the word Aten over the word Re. And then the word Re Herakti, or Horus in association with it. Horus just means the one who is far, the one who is up in the heavens. That would be the way of understanding the hawk. That's a word that's got to be, or name that's got to be removed along with the being itself. So the monotheism argument, it's not something that can be discarded, in my opinion, though it's not fashionable to see it as monotheism. And one of the arguments I make in my book, The Good Kings, is if the Christianity, the Catholic, Roman Catholic Christianity that I grew up with, that treated Saint Beatrice and Saint Anne as pseudo divinities in their sense, with feast days and the ability to pray to them and ask them for help and get a prayer card, and or to pray to Mother Mary and to pray to the divine feminine. She is a goddess in the Roman Catholic Christian system. She is a goddess. She is treated as such. There is no difference. We call that Christianity monotheism. Yes, there is a Reformation, and Martin Luther comes along, and a lot of other thinkers who try to clean it out and say, okay, let's get rid of all of this divinization of Mary. Let's get rid of all of these saints. Let's remove all of these pagan holdouts and purify this, clean it up. And some are more successful than others, right? But there is never going to they're never going to throw out this idea of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, right? It's a tough one. You may not have a Trinity as key to your religion. You may have a more monotheist Reformation Christianity, but the way the religion works is still quite henotheistic, or divinity can splinter. It has one source, but can splinter up into many. And Akhenaten is doing exactly the same. And when he says that his body is the divine emanation on earth, he's doing a very Christian or pre-Christian kind of thing. So on that point, when Akhenaten tells us that there is only one God, that's what he's saying. It's very direct. I'm going to take him at his word and say, this is monotheism. That's where I stand. And it pisses a lot of people off in my field, but this is what I read Akhenaten telling us. And given what I grew up with, I don't see any real problem with it. So that's where I'm gonna come down on that one.
Can you expand more on the cartouche that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah. So sorry, I'm taking notes for something that I want to say later. There, I'm done. So the cartouche is super interesting, and there's a really well-known Egyptologist named Donald Redford who said that the Egyptians, and Akhenaten in particular, when they created this monotheistic scheme, this new theology, when Akhenaten did, he lowered the level of divinity and he raised the level of kingship. Monotheism has a purpose. It has a political purpose, which I go all into in my chapter in the Good Kings. And that purpose is, it works for the humans who are here on earth. Any ideology shift, any big change, any big prophet coming in, you go ahead and read your Hebrew Bible, read your Gospels with Jesus coming in as a prophet. Any big shift is always in response to something that is happening in this earth in the here and now. It is political. And so this idea that Akhenaten is creating a God that is going to aggrandize his own personal body as a son of that God would make sense. And the cartouche goes along with that. So the way this usually works, you go into a temple. I was just in Egypt, went into a whole bunch of temples. You go into a temple, and when you see the name of the king, it's always surrounded in what we call a cartouche, which is a French word, because Egyptology is colonial. And this French word, it means cartridge. And they called these long rings, solar rings, because it is meant to be the solar circuit. They called them cartouches, the French savants did, because it looked like the cartridges that they would put into their rifles. And that name stuck, and we still call these things cartouches. The Egyptians did not use this word. They would call it a shen ring, which is associated with the solar circle, and other words in association with the name ring. The king gets to put his name in a shen ring, or at least two of his names go into a shen ring. His birth name and his throne name go into a shen ring. So ostensibly the name he's born with, though that's not always clear, particularly with some later Ramessids. And then the name that the priests and that he come up with when he's invested with kingship, and when the royal Ka enters his body and he enters that shamanic state, he's given a new name, right? Those two names are put into the cartouche. The king, he's set apart as a good god. He is divinized, but he's called a good god with the cartouche name. Re-Herakti, Osiris, Ptah, these are great gods. Necher-Aa. And their names are not written in cartouches. They're not contained within anything. They don't need to be contained. They have power from their own side, and there is nothing frightening that could come at these divinities. They are the power. So if you're reading a text in hieroglyphic inscription, you'll see the king's names in these cartouches, or other containers. It could be a Horus name that's within the palace container. And you'll see the god's name appearing outside of a cartouche. Good God versus great God. What Akhenaten does is he takes the anthropomorphic part of the god, the sun god, away, says that the sun god is alone, puts a uraeus cobra on the sun's head. He's all head, right? He's just a round sun. Puts a cobra on the uraeus, which is a sign of kingship, and puts his names in uraei, which is lowering the level of divinity and making the god, that physical emanation that you can see, hear, feel, touch, maybe not here, but yeah, making that into something that's kingly. And then what Akhenaten does when he gives him this cartouche name, and the first cartouche name does have the Re Harakti element in it, that will be taken out. The Shu element, Shu being air that is filled with light, or space that is filled with light, that will also be a part of the name, and that will be removed, sort of, but it's hard to take out concepts that don't have any other word for them. But when he grants this cartouche name, he also gives the Aten a Sed festival. Now, let me tell you how bizarre this is. A god doesn't need a Sed festival. Sed festival means the festival of the tail. It's like a jubilee, and it is celebrated after 30 years of rule. And the Sed festival, evidence for it goes all the way back 5,000 years to around 3000 BCE, if not before. And it's a celebration of 30 years of rule that is meant to revivify the king, wake him up again, get him out of his dusty old bones, get him running, get him going, renew the kingship. It's in need of a charge, right? So you get this charge from the divinities. And what Akhenaten does is in year 5, at Thebes, probably also at Heliopolis and Memphis, we just don't have preservation of that. We only have the best preservation at Thebes. He celebrates a Sed festival for the god. But it's like a Sed festival for him as the king. But he can't say that because it's only year 5. It's not year 30. It's not even close to year 30. So the very beginnings of his reign. And he's been prepping the Sed festival from year 2, as far as we can see. So, and it is possible that this Sed festival happened before year 5. We'll leave that timing there. But it's an extraordinary thing that he's taking all of these trappings of kingship and giving it to this physicalized emanation in the heavens that rises and sets. But he's trying to take on that power of this golden orb in the sky and transfer it to himself, I would argue. So the cartouche it's everything. It gives you, these authoritarian leaders, whether they're Ramses II or Akhenaten, they don't keep diaries. They're not like, today I'm going to do this because of that. And authoritarian regimes generally don't allow their courtiers to keep diaries either, because any sort of discussion of what's happening in the royal court is going to get you nothing but in trouble. So people don't talk. They verbalize things, but they don't commit it to writing. So we actually have no idea why Akhenaten is doing this. We don't know what his end game is. We don't know what his insecurities, passions, hopes, and dreams are. We have no idea. You have to use tools like this. You have to be like, interesting. He's using a cartouche, something that's been established for millennia. He's giving that to the god. Doesn't that kind of pull the god down? He's giving him that cobra uraeus, saying the god needs that kind of protection of the goddess. Cobra is a goddess. How are we to understand this? But it's giving the god the trappings of kingship and participating thereby in that cult. So it's complicated stuff. This isn't easy to figure out by any means.
So why do you think they chose not to keep those types of records that you were just talking about?
Yeah, don't I wish we had them? I think it's different political systems. The system that we are used to in the quote unquote West, or that the ancient Romans or that the ancient Greeks were used to, is a system that publishes the foibles, mistakes, and achievements as perceived by its community. So if you're reading about Pericles and you have some ancient documentation preserved, you'll see that he's blamed for this great war with Sparta, and it's driving everyone insane, this Peloponnesian War. And people blame him for having this girlfriend, Hetera, who's a courtesan. And they're like, it's all her fault. We actually have this preserved in texts because in that system, that Athenian democratia, it was useful for people to take down their rulers. And because it might have gotten them killed to say something like that, but it got them a following. It got them a political coalition. It helped them to build support and followers to go out there and say these things. In Rome, if you're going to say a whole bunch of shitty things about Julius Caesar and say, he has fainting spells and he's not very healthy, or you're going to talk about Mark Antony and all the many girlfriends that he had and how he cheated on his wife and this and that. It's a way of taking down your rival politically in a way that we understand perfectly, right? This is the way our political system works. So we have a very hard time understanding in our Western United States world, why in God's name would anyone not talk about these things? We have such a hard time understanding this and are so embedded in our own way of doing things that it means that many Egyptologists assume that what the king is telling you is the absolute truth and that there's nothing behind it, that there's no subterfuge, there's no propaganda, there's no sleight of hand, and that everything that they're telling you is as it was. And I would counter that and say, by no means. This is a regime of extraordinary unequal power, and it is our duty as historians to look at this regime and to try to understand what political reasons may have driven someone to do this or that. Even when you're talking about an ideology, even when you're talking about a religious system, there's still an economy to it. There's still a political agenda to it. There's still all kinds of other agendas behind it that one can discuss as embedded in their society. The reason the Egyptians wouldn't discuss it is because it would serve the courtiers and the priests and the generals and all of the men who serve the king, not at all. In fact, Akhenaten knew this. He presents a theology that is so far out in left field, to use a baseball analogy that the Egyptians would not understand. It's so out there that he knows who's with him and who's against him like that, because he can then say, oh, there's only one God. And the loyal person is he'd be like, yes, my Lord, there's only one God. And the guy that is going to fight him on it and maybe has a big, powerful family, and maybe that powerful family has access to men they could draft into an armed force of some kind, he might fight back. He might, but he's probably not going to commit it to writing. It's not going to help. And that's not how political power seems to have been created in ancient Egypt. He might say it, but then he'll just be moved aside. The king will know you're not the one that's loyal to me. Don't want to be working with you. So there are all kinds of reasons why we don't have evidence for why Akhenaten did what he did, for what the reactions were of the people when he did it, from his closest family to high-level elites whose families have been in power for some time, to generals who were told to carry out his orders. We have almost no information about what people thought about the crazy shit that was going down, and it must have been pretty crazy.
Did Pharaoh Akhenaten, let me rephrase, why did Pharaoh Amenhotep IV change his name to Akhenaten?
Yeah, it's an extraordinary thing, and it's not something you can really find comparisons for. There are kings who changed their birth name before they became king, I would assume, given the 11 Ramses of dynasties 19 and 20. I have to assume that those 11 men were not all named Ramses. Maybe Ramses the first, Ramses the second, Ramses the third. But then when you get to the fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, are they all named Ramses? It is possible that everyone is named Ramses in the way that if you go to certain cities, everyone's named Ahmed Mohammed in Egypt, Ahmed Mohammed, or, it's a very common name, right? But everyone, and with in the 20th dynasty, with no deviation, I do tend to believe that there was a name change when these men were enthroned. But to be on the throne and to have a birth name and a cartouche that is of such profound significance because you are the fourth bearer of that name, and then to decide, I don't want this name. In fact, this name is abhorrent to me. This name has an element of the god Amen in it that I want no part of. That to be so upset by that name that you change it into something else that serves your divinity, well, that's an extraordinary thing to do. And that's something that I don't know of any other king in 3,000 years of Egyptian history having done. So the name change for Akhenaten is, it's a big deal. I don't want to say revolutionary. Egyptologists toss about the word revolutionary a lot. And I try not to use it very specifically, because revolution is a grassroots bottom-up endeavor. This is by no means a bottom-up endeavor. This is very much top-down. This is the king dictating whom people should worship, how they should worship him as king, his God, where they should worship, what is appropriate, orthodox, you might even say, and what is not. This is not revolutionary. Yes, is it revolutionary thinking? I reject the word there as well. It's aberrant thinking. It's unusual thinking. It's genius level thinking. It's Schiff's massive punctuated equilibrium thinking, but it's not revolutionary thinking. And I can't remember the question that you asked me, and I hope I answered it. What was it, Jacob?
I was my question is why did Amenhotep IV change his name to Akhenaten?
Okay, so let's get to that. So the change of the name is to signal his new God and his new religion and his rejection of the old. So Amen-Re is the god of Thebes par excellence, and Akhenaten, or Amenhotep IV, comes from this Theban city and a Theban dynasty. This isn't the first Theban dynasty, it's the second Theban dynasty. There was the third. There was the 11th dynasty, Theban dynasty, 12th dynasty, and then we skip forward to the 17th/18th. Okay, so maybe it's the fourth. But a whole lot of kings are coming from this Theban region. And he rejects that. He moves his capital city, or his hometown, away from Thebes. He moves his capitals away from Heliopolis and Memphis. And he moves his capital city around the same time that he changes his name. So let's talk about what the names mean. Amenhotep means Amen is at peace, or Amen is satisfied. It has to do with offerings that you give to the god in the temple, and it associates the king with the high priest, the one who is making sure that the god is placated, that he's made happy, right? Akhenaten, it means the same thing, but for a different god. He is the one who is effective, for the Aton. So he's the one who placates. He's the one who makes the god happy, the one who is effective, the one who's beneficent, the one, is a tough word. It's, if you ask 2 Egyptologists, or you ask 6 Egyptologists what the definition of Ba, Ka, and are, you're going to get 6 different answers, because there's very little disagreement on this. And the Egyptians, while they tried to help us understand it, this is deep theology. The Ka is like the sexual ability to procreate oneself, a kind of patriarchal power. It's a power that needs to feed and have sex, but it's a power that finds strength through lineage. The Ba is like a power that can move about, a power that can come and go, a power that can be manifold and physicalized. And the Egyptians drew it as a human-headed bird if it belonged to a normal person. There's another spirit that's called the and this is the element that Akhenaten's name comes from. And it's a bird that has a little head cloth. It's of feathers, but it looks like a little head cloth, like a little Nemi's headdress. And the is the humans who have died and gone to the other side and gone through the weighing of the heart. Akhenaten doesn't believe in this, or it doesn't tell us that he believes in this, by the way. It's a question we could get to next. But when the dead get through the very difficult interrogations, trials, and tribulations and court of afterlife, when they get through that and to the beautiful and good parts of the afterlife, they become an akh. It's kind of like in the Muslim tradition, a dead person becoming a sheikh, or in the Christian tradition, a person becoming a saint. You become something that is more powerful than just some dead ghost human. You are given an agency that you did not have before. And if we went back in time in our time machine and went into an ancient Egyptian house, we would see in the front hallway, or maybe the back hallway, debatable, we would see an ancestor bust. And we would go to that ancestor bust daily, I'm sure, like you would do in a Japanese or Korean household. And you would pray like this. You would put your hands up like this. You would pray to your ancestors and you would ask, dear ancestors, please, give me this, give me that. And you would understand certain ancestors have as being achified, if I may take an Egyptian word and put it together with some English, made into an ach. You're like a superhuman ghost. You're a super entity that can traverse between the two worlds, pull from the realm of the gods and bring it to the realm of the living. And Akhenaten, when he names himself Akhenaten, he's like calling himself the Superman of the Aten, the superhuman element before death of the Aten. It's a supercharged name. And I do want you to think of it as like, my name, what is my name? Superman or Batman. I wonder if elites would have laughed at it when they heard it. I actually don't know. We can never know this. But it is like a way of saying, no, Clark Kent during the day, Superman at night. Well, that's Batman who's at night. But whatever, it doesn't matter. But he's made himself into this extraordinary being who can act on behalf of the sun god, can placate the sun god, can speak to the sun god, can do all of the things that the humans need the sun god to do. And ancient Egyptian humans are not stupid. No, they don't have the scientific understanding of photosynthesis, but they do understand that the sun is what is needed for the seed to crack open and to grow and to sprout. And that's where you get your wheat, which you make into beer and bread, and that's what everything is about. So the sun is it's a huge part of power in the ancient Egyptian economic world as much as anything else. So for Akhenaten to then say, I am the beneficent one, the beneficial one, the effective one for the sun, he can be the mouthpiece and do anything for that god. It's an extraordinary name. And then the fact that he changed it, boom, it's amazing that he did that.
Why did Pharaoh Akhenaten, actually, let me say this instead. Did Pharaoh Akhenaten view his father as the incarnation of Aton? And is the Aton and the Aton the same god, or were they later conflated as the same god? In either way, would that make Shu Akhenaten and Tefnut Nefertiti?
Yeah, these are such fun questions and shows that you've done your homework. And just to be correct, you said the word Atum, right?
Aten and Atum.
Yes. Okay, so for your listeners, there are three basic manifestations of the sun. The morning sun is Khepri, the heifer beetle, that which comes into being. That's the dawn sun, the newborn sun. The noon sun is Re, simply Re, or it could be Re Harakti, that strong, powerful, it's going to burn your skin. Nobody wants to be outside when the sun is right at midheaven, right? It's really hot. And then there's the setting sun in the west, and that is Atum or Atum Re. And he is the sun that is going to die, who knows he's going to die. He has no way of getting out of his death. But as he is dying, he creates his next incarnation. He rebirths himself through his death. This is a very cyclical Christian type understanding. And indeed, many notions of Jesus's resurrection, I would argue, do come from this solar understanding of divinity recreating itself with itself. So Atum is that God who can recreate himself with himself, by himself. And so your question is asking, did Akhenaten worship Amenhotep III as Atum? And it is possible that, and here Egyptologists really try to use chronologies, architecture, temple architecture, tomb architecture, to try to argue for a co-regency. And a co-regency is when two kings are on the throne at the same time. We know the Egyptians had co-regencies because Thutmose III was on the throne at the same time as Hatshepsut. Both of them were king. It's an unusual co-regency, but it existed. There were many Middle Kingdom co-regencies potentially as well, of kings being on the throne at the same time. But 18th dynasty seems to have more documented co-regencies, like Thutmose III and his much younger son Amenhotep II. They probably had a co-regency as well. So let's just keep it to the 18th dynasty. When we know that there were these co-regencies, did Akhenaten then have a co-regency with Amenhotep III? And I swear this is like the biggest problem. It makes me crazy. Like, I don't know how to answer this question. It drives me crazy that there's evidence for potentially a 3-year co-regency. There's evidence for a 5-year co-regency. There's people who argue for a 12-year co-regency. And it's just like, I don't know how to deal with that, right? And the evidence is, it can all be taken in whichever way that you want. So many problems of this period, because it is so aberrant, unique. You can take evidence for meaning two diametrically opposed things. And it's very, very frustrating. This is such a case. There are some Egyptologists that claim there was no co-regency, that Amenhotep III died, and Thutmose, the crown prince, had already died. And so, boom, Akhenaten becomes king, and Amenhotep IV, becomes king, and he will then rename himself Akhenaten by year 5. If there was a co-regency, however, and if some of the earlier texts that Akhenaten created that are preserved at Karnak Temple and Luxor Temple in particular, it would mean that he's treating his father as divinized already in life, and he's associating his father with the sun who will set in the west, who will die, and that he is associating himself with the Aton who is strong and will live and continue on. And that you ask then, is Tefnut the consort? Is that Nefertiti? Is that how we're meant to understand it? I think these Egyptological ideas are really interesting, and they are theological ideas that Akhenaten plays with at the beginning of his reign. And I think these things are possible, but I can't tell you definitively whether or not they're true. All I will say is that Akhenaten, when he became Akhenaten, or even before he became Akhenaten, was coming up with something new and was playing around with, and I mean that word playing, not to denigrate, but to show that he was trying new things. Some of them didn't work and he discarded them. Some of them he liked and he kept them up. But as he's going through this process of deciding what he wants his theological regime to be when he grows up, it may have involved his father. If it did involve his father, though, he had to kill his father. It gets very Darth Vader. It gets very Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader. You must face your father and kill him, and whatever we are told in the Star Wars mythology. In the end, Akhenaten decides that living or dead, his father and any memory of him, or most memory of him, has to be removed, because he sends out his artists to destroy instead of create. He sends out his artists to remove the name Amen, even from the name of his father, Amenhotep III. So Tefnut's not going to get the same systematic treatment, but Tefnut doesn't get the same systematic cult. He just stops using those kinds of divinities in his theological discussions, hymns, and temples. But whatever he started with, if he started with an understanding of solar cycles with many names, and it seems he did, if he put those into a co-regency, or even if the king Amenhotep III had already died and Akhenaten understood himself as the son of the sun king and elevated that sun king to a sun god, he changed a lot of that as he went along. So it works, but it was short-lived, so short-lived that we can't talk about it as much more than just confusion. Yeah.
Do we know anything about what caused Pharaoh Akhenaten to decide to make the Aten the only god?
No, no. I mean, it's a sun god. So we'll go with that simple explanation that sun gods, and I remark upon this in the book, The Good Kings, sun gods are very useful for authoritarian power. They're very useful for claiming an unassailable authoritarian power and for an association of authoritarian power with violent power. But a sun god is associated with gold, golden things, that golden light, but also wealth, gold as it appears in the earth, like this golden metal, this malleable, extraordinarily miraculous metal. So to be a sun king, whether it's in China or it's in France or it's in Egypt, is to associate yourself with unimaginable wealth and to associate yourself with a kind of power that can fund itself, can sustain itself, or it will burn you irrevocably. So let's go with that for the sun god part of it. Why choose him? Why doesn't he make his regime all about Osiris? He could have done that. Why doesn't he make his regime all about, like, if he were to be as physicalized about Osiris, he wouldn't pick Osiris, he would pick Geb, the earth, right? Because Geb is like, or Taharqa, he would pick something associated with the physicality of the earth. And that is a masculinized entity in ancient Egypt. It isn't in the Greek and Roman traditions, but it is for Egypt. But he doesn't pick earth. He picks sun. And sun is associated with that extraordinary power. So, yeah, why he picks the Aten, though, that's where it gets... I can answer your sun versus earth question, or sun versus wind, sun versus sky, sure. But because of the masculine power that it manifests, and because of the masculine power of reproductive strength, a sun is about creating new lineage. And he wanted that to be clarified to his people too. He shows his wife and his reproduction with all of his, with his wife and his daughters. So he is meant to be fecund, that divinity. The Aten, though, picking that as opposed to saying, everyone, we're going to worship Re Herakti, or everyone, we're going to worship Khepri, the noonday sun, or Khepri Re Atum, which is a manifestation one could worship. He does not do that. He chooses the Aten, the thing. And here it gets really interesting, because so much of iconoclasm, and Akhenaten was an iconoclast. It means that you're going to destroy the images of the gods, right? In the same way a Muslim believer would say that any image of Muhammad or Allah is not allowed, right? It's haram. It's something that you cannot depict because it is an iconoclastic religion. You're not meant to have that image of divinity. Akhenaten is picking the Aten because there is no physicalized image of divinity. It's just this abstract round thing. And he has a lot of power over that. When he picks the Aten, he's the only game in town. He, the king, is the only game in town. His body, his mind, his thoughts, his words. The Aten doesn't speak anymore. The king speaks for the Aten. The Aten doesn't, gods would have consorts and have sex and listen to music, and they would cry and they would get angry and they would do all of these things in the mythology. None of that is possible for this round thing. It's got hands that come along at the end of its rays, and those hands hold little ankh, symbols of life, but it's not got a face. It doesn't have eyes, doesn't have a mouth to speak or feed with, can't hear anything as far as we can see. So it takes all of the power of divinity and it puts it all on Akhenaten himself. It's an extraordinarily clever thing to do in the short term, and an extraordinarily unsatisfactory thing to do in the long term, because you better have a good prophet or your religion is not necessarily going to make it that far.
How did the Egyptians react to Pharaoh Akhenaten's decision to force everyone to only worship the Aten?
Well, we don't know that he forced everyone to do it. So
All right.
that, I mean, here's how I'm not trying to play around with your question, because I do agree he did try in his way, right? He, if you have all of these temples that are doing work, ritual work for these different gods, and these are state temples that are funded by the king, and there's one for Atum Re in Heliopolis and one for Ptah and his white walls at Memphis, and you go on, and the king Akhenaten is like, you guys don't believe it, don't want it, it's done, I'm pulling my cash. He pulls his funding. What are you going to do? If he goes a step further and he says, oh, I want your funding and I want the good shit that's in those temples. That's what Henry VIII did. Why wouldn't Akhenaten do the same? Why wouldn't he send out his guys and say, give us your statues, they're inappropriate, give us your golden gods, your golden calves, if you like, and hand them over, and we want them, and then whatever you do, we don't really care, but we've taken all the money, right? It doesn't stop the cult activity, doesn't stop the fervent belief, but it does stop the professionalization of it. It stops the ability for a priest to do that full time. It means that people have to find other ways to fund their temples and their spaces. And it does seem that he did the first part of what I said. He clearly shut down these temples and took all of the funding and put it toward the creation of a new capital city out in Middle Egypt. And with that funding gone, people then would have continued to worship the gods as they wanted. There's no evidence that he sent out thought police, if you like, right? Like there's no Khmer Rouge going out or Little Red Book, or Henry VIII's minions going out and making sure that people weren't doing Catholic-like things. I mean, you're not there forcibly converting. We don't have evidence for that. I'm not saying that it didn't happen in high elite families or things like that, but we don't have any evidence for it. And what we do have evidence for is an elite replacement. Elite replacement is a really wonderful concept that historians use all the time. It essentially means if you can't get all of your elites to do what you want them to do, then you just get a new set of elites. You just replace them. Or if new people come in and invade, like say there's the Arab invasion into Egypt, you have an elite replacement. All of the Egyptian native elites who were there running towns and cities, old families, were removed and Arab elites replaced them. People of Arab origin speaking Arabic language, imposing Arabic economic ways, and that elite replacement elementally changed Egypt starting in the 7th century and going into the 8th. Akhenaten seems to have engaged in an elite replacement of his own and used theology to determine who was in and who was out. And a lot of the old elites, courtiers and priests, don't seem to have accompanied him to his new capital city, though many did. But there's a lot of new men showing up, men who are associated with the military in particular, mercenary type men. And I mean the word mercenary as an adjective, not necessarily as an actual mercenary. And these mercenary type men are shown with the king. They're shown underneath the window of appearances, holding their hands out as the king throws solid gold trinkets out to them, and they gratefully receive them. And they are the new elite for the king. So it's less Akhenaten getting everyone to do this new religion and more Akhenaten favoring, rewarding, co-opting those who are willing to go along with his schemes. So it's a different way of going about it, much more human way of going about it. It's a difficult thing to pull out belief systems by the root. It's also not very long-term. It doesn't work in the long term. People will react against that kind of thought policing after a few generations at the very least. But Akhenaten and his people, his agents, they had their ways to get people to do things. But by no means does that mean that people in Egypt stopped worshiping the old gods. They kept everything up. I'm sure they did. They would have kept it up not even in secret in some ways. Maybe at the big temples they kept it up in secret, but in people's private shrines and private homes, there's more than enough evidence that people were continuing old burial traditions. They were continuing old ritual worship of divinities like Osiris or Ptah. But those who are under the watch of this new elite and those who are in the capital city, they had to be more careful. And they had to follow along with these new religious ways, even to the point of abandoning Osiris and abandoning all of their carefully drawn up cheat sheets, maps, interrogation answers for what to do when you die. And that's pretty extraordinary that that elites were like, okay, fine, I'll go along with you, Akhenaten, even into death, where I know in my heart that I'm going to be interrogated by all of these demons, and I won't have the answers written down on my Book of the Dead because I don't get to bring a Book of the Dead with me. Okay, my family's getting rich, I'm in. People went along with it. Some people went along with it.
And what became of the Aten after Pharaoh Akhenaten's death?
That's a really good question, and I haven't followed it up, so I can't really tell you. I mean, he's not like a super popular god. We can't expect him to be, because he's so associated. I say he because the Egyptians say he. They don't say it. They didn't have that third gender possibility. But he's so associated with that theology of Akhenaten that you see the Aten mentioned. The word doesn't go away. The word means the actual sun in the sky. Like, no, you guys, the sun. It's weird that in English we wouldn't do that, right? We have the sun. If we said the sun god in Egyptian, if you wanted to say the sun or the sun god, you could say Re for the sun, but it was more specific to say the Aten. But it would be like in English saying, no, the actual sun. To repeat it. And I was just reading some Ramses texts that mention the Aten. When the sun itself is specifically denoted, they're going to use that word. But as a god with a cult, we're not seeing that continued at all. And those temples that Akhenaten built, they are not continued at all. So there's a weight that goes along with that vocabulary word. Every time there is a violent regime, there's a weight with certain words. Like, take the German word Lösung, solution, right? It's just a word. It can mean a solution of a mathematical problem or a solution for what to do about all of the Jews in Europe. And you have this horrible notion of the final solution, right? Once Nazism was done, all kinds of words, simple, basic words that had taken on new meaning, had to be removed and changed into something else. The very word Reich, which means regime, had to be taken out of the language, and the Reichstag had to become the Bundestag, right? So the words are very powerful things, and they bring up cultural memories. And even though the Aten references the sun in the sky, and even though its use continues on because of what it means, the cult changes, and then other words have to be purged from the language. It would be interesting to do a study of what those words were. And so any budding Egyptologists out there who want to do a dissertation, that's a really fun topic. I'd love to help work on something like that.
And did Atenism have any influence at all on the rise of monotheism in Judaism?
That's the $64 million question, right, Jacob? So you ask most Egyptologists, they'll say, no, there's no evidence for this. I don't really see it. Some might, there is Jan Assmann, who wrote the book Moses the Egyptian. Freud, not an Egyptologist, of course, but a psychoanalyst, made those connections. It is a very interesting thing that you have the creation of the world's first monotheism in Egypt around 1350 BCE, and then you see the beginnings of a monotheism in West Asia, in the Levant, around I mean, 800 BC at the earliest. But if we're taking the Book of Kings and giving a hard chronology to it, which we can often do, you'll have an 8th and 7th century BCE Iron Age reality in which people are not following monotheism. At least not. You read your Second Kings. Most of the kings are not doing what is right in the eyes of the Lord. And if you read your Exodus, which, I mean, people try to date it to 1000 BCE. Fine, let's do it. Let's date it to 1000 BCE. They're not monotheists there. They've got the golden calf. They're doing all kinds of other worship, and God and certain prophets are trying to encourage this new monotheism to take root, but it hasn't taken root as the law of the land. These time periods are not too far apart. You take a 1350 and you take an 1000, you know, you've got 350 years between the two of them. It's not a huge amount of time. If you're talking about going all the way to 700 or 600 BCE, it's a much longer span of time. And the historicity of the Bible is a hugely problematic thing. And I'm not going to try to give you the historicity of the Exodus. But I do think that the Exodus has kernels of truth in it. So, I mean, the short answer to your question is yes, I do see connections. So let's go into that. Enough dissembling, and I'll go ahead and tell you what it is that I think. You can look at Psalm 104 in your Hebrew Bible, and you can see phrase for phrase connections between that and the great hymn to the Aten. And I find that mind-blowing evidence of a connection. Is it a direct connection? I mean, somebody kept this theology safe. Somebody preserved it. It meant something to somebody somewhere, such that you could have that part of the hymn to the Aten find its way into the Psalms. And I only know of that one. If somebody else wants to do a more careful reading of the Psalms and see what else they can find, cool, go for it. I wonder if there's anything else that we haven't recognized yet. It is completely possible. And the idea of monotheism itself, I don't want to be a diffusionist. One of the reasons that people don't like to say that monotheism was invented in Egypt and then found its way to West Asia, where it then found a second life. The reason people don't like to hold to such a theory is because diffusionism is very unpopular, not just unfashionable, but it's practically immoral. And I'll tell you why. Diffusionism implies that things can only be invented once by certain great men. So you invent it once here, and then it has to be brought over there. It can be used in a very racist way to say that people invented agriculture in this place. They could only invent it this one time because it was some great genius brain that came up with it, and then it had to spread to other places. And to assign diffusionism to this and to say, oh, Akhenatens invented a monotheism, and then it went to the lands of the Hebrew Bible, implies that there's no agency on the part of the people, the men, who wrote the Hebrew Bible. And that can't be the case. So diffusionist arguments are problematic. They're very problematic. And I don't want to insist that the people of the Levant couldn't have come up with a monotheist idea on their own, and that it wouldn't have been political use to them. You can just read the book of 2 Kings and see how it's politically useful to come up with monotheism, because it gives the Yahweh priests extraordinary power. They can say to a host of people, the kings are not doing what is right. They can talk shit about kings. They can speak truth to power. They can use their theology to take down the strongest political element in their world. And if monotheism can do that, I'm amazed that it took that long for people to grab it and use it in some kind of way. Akhenaten, but at the same time, the other token, you're like, but monotheism is such a huge shift, it has to be imposed. So maybe to really create the experiment of monotheism, it had to be top down at first. It had to be somebody with all the money and all the power in the known world who said, you guys, we're doing it this way. This is my God. Follow through with this, or else this is how we're doing it. And the experiment then developed because it was imposed, because it was demanded, because it was pushed. Doing it from the bottom up, which is the monotheism that we see in the Hebrew Bible, or at least not from the top down. A Yahweh priest is certainly not at the very bottom of society. This is also no grassroots endeavor. It's an elite-driven, priest-driven endeavor. But to do something from a bottom-up approach to speak truth to power, it changes the nature of what we think monotheism is, which is the main reason, this is what I wrote down all that time ago, the main reason I think we don't want to see Akhenaten's theological schema as monotheism is because it's not the monotheism that we want to see. We want to see a monotheism that is speaking truth to power rather than a monotheism that is created at the top and imposed down. We want to see a monotheism that makes a political system account for its mistakes. We want a monotheism that pushes against the billionaire class, if you like. And when we see that kind of monotheism that reflects our values, that's monotheism. And I'm here to say, but you guys, Akhenaten was actually a better monotheist than they are in Second Kings. Like, no joke. Akhenaten follows through and is more clear and explicit in his texts about there being one God, and follows through over a 17-year reign of getting rid of Reharakti, getting rid of Shu, getting rid of these other divinities, and cleaning it up and purifying it, engaging in the iconoclasm. He does a much better job of it than anybody does in the Levantine highlands of the Second Kings. So, we want the Second Kings monotheism to be real monotheism, the Egyptian monotheism to just be playland. It's just because it's not the monotheism we want. That's all it is. So, okay, so to your question, is there a direct connection? Let's not make it direct. Though Egypt abuts the West Levant, it abuts West Asia. They're right next to each other. Somebody brought this idea over and connected it to the Psalms. Somebody was singing this. If the great hymn to the Aton was meant to be sung, as I think it was, then those songs continued. And those songs were brought to other places, and people sang those songs. The great hymn to the Aton was maybe brought over in a kind of epic song to other places. It infected people. They thought about it. They're like, what is this? And parts of it grabbed hold, and parts of it didn't. Parts of it didn't work in the society that was the Levantine Highlands, and others did. So, yeah, there's a connection, but it doesn't discount the agency of the people of the Levantine Highlands who then used it. Long answer. Sorry about that. That was a tough one.
Oh no, it was great. Yeah, you went into great detail there. I like long answers. Let's take a couple of super chat questions. Quackshot, thank you for your super chat. What did you think about the Hancock Dibble discussion?
I just did a podcast about this for Archeo Soup, and it will air tonight. So look to, I'll post it. It was a really fun discussion with two archaeologists, and we go into extraordinary detail about the Flint Dibble Graham Hancock discussion. What they're referring to is the debate that Graham Hancock had with the archaeologist Flint Dibble on the Joe Rogan podcast. And it was a 4.5-hour debate where each brought all kinds of evidence and tried to counter. And it was a pretty extraordinary thing to see. And I have opinions, and yeah, those opinions are on that podcast. So you're in luck. I have indeed spoken on this subject. Mm-hmm.
Let's get to the next super chat. Nemo History, thank you for your super chat. How does concretizing something, fixing a material reference, make it more abstract?
Isn't that weird? I agree. It's the craziest thing. It makes it more abstract, and yet it also makes it, I would say it makes it more abstract because it makes it less human. So you're taking the anthropomorphic divinity away, the human-like divinity away. If the humans are in the shape of gods and God's created man in his own image, that kind of notion goes away, because the Aten did not create humans in Akhenaten's scheme in his own image. He is the creator, but we're not all walking around. Well, you can't. We're not all round things, right? So it separates humanity from divinity. It's not as above, so below. It's different, and it makes divinity into something that is so unlike us that we have to think of it in abstract terms. That it's now this idea of God with a big G. It's a God who is alone, a God who has no other elements, and it's a God that doesn't have human emotionality. Human emotionality is not abstract, right? It's like, oh my God, you're hangry because you didn't eat lunch and now you're having an argument about something, or it's deep grief over the loss of somebody very close to you. These things are not abstract. They're very what do people say, that we walk around in our meat suit? This is not abstract. It's a pain. There's shit and piss and birth and death and sex, and this God does none of that. None of it. He's just this round thing. Is it a globe? Is it a disc? Does it matter? It's this entity. And that entity is responsible for all creation, and yet the mechanism of it is also abstracted. It's when you look at, and you guys can all Google this right now. So go to your computers, go to Google, put in Akhenaten, Aton, or just Akhenaten. Anytime Akhenaten depicts himself, he shows himself with the Aton, right? Look at that image of the sun. Look at the sun's rays coming off of it. Those are its arms. So it's like this abstract being with 17 arms or 6 arms, depending on how big a sun is depicted, ending in these hands that are very abstracted. They're like these perfect little tiny hands, like little back scratcher hands, right? I happen to have a back scratcher right here. It's like this kind of a little hand on the end of, this is perfect actually. It's like an Aton ray, right? So we'll make it come down like an Aton ray from my head. And that would work. So he doesn't even get real arms. And you do that to a divinity and you're going to create a very different understanding of what God is. And you will depend that much more on the non-abstracted humanity of the God's prophet, of the God's son, S-O-N, not S-U-N. That's a great question.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dr. Kara Cooney.
Thank you for having me. It was super fun. Really, really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks. And thank you to the 2 people that super chatted, and I thank everybody else for watching this stream. And I'll see everybody later.
Thank you. Super fun.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.